As Bill said, we're going to be in the latter part of 3 John, but I want to start today in the Gospel of John, chapter 13 in the upper room. And this is just something that I think about from the point of view that we have certain events that take place, and it's kind of like we kind of go into a tunnel and then things happen on the other side. But in the upper room, we have these, Jesus is going to wash the disciples' feet. He will predict his betrayal. But how sobering is this? He is mentioning, one of you is going to betray me. This is 13:28. The disciples stared at one another at loss to know. And one of them, the disciple whom Jesus loved, was reclining next to him. And they're probably at a small table, kind of like on couches, pillows, or whatever. And I always see John right here next to our Lord. And so Peter says to John, ask him, Jesus, which one he means. And so leaning back against Jesus, and I think it's John, asked, Lord, who is it? It's the one to whom I give this piece of bread when I dip it in the dish. Dipping the piece of bread, he gave it to Judas Iscariot, son of Simon. And as soon as Judas took the bread, Satan entered him. I mean, I just literally get the chills when I read this. How sobering is it to think that, and I don't think that this was against Judas's will. I don't think he was possessed. I think it was because of his heart and his decisions that he was going to make. And Jesus just says, what you are about to do, do quickly. And no one at the table understood why Jesus said this. And as we mentioned in previous lessons, Judas went out and it was night. And listening to Leon Morris talk about this, he said it was dark outside and it was dark in Judas's soul. But here's why I started with this, and this is just one of those things for you to contemplate and to think. Remember, they studied the scriptures today to see if these things were so. I wonder if the one person who was the most surprised on resurrection morning is Satan himself. Because why would you enter Judas to get Judas to betray Jesus, to have him crucified, if you knew that God was going to raise Jesus on the first day of the week triumphantly? See what I'm saying in terms of kind of looking back? And Luke also is going to say, Satan entered Judas. And my expression would be, Judas opened the door. In the Gospel of Matthew, remember, what a waste. Frivolous woman. This ointment could have been sold for a great amount and on and on. And why is the treasurer upset about this waste of money? He's taken money out of the treasury himself. And Matthew says, then he went to the chief priest and he starts talking about 30 pieces of silver to betray Jesus. So God never violates our free will, but he oftentimes accomplishes his will with people like Pharaoh to allow their natural tendencies and what they were going to do to help fulfill that. And the reason I bring this up, and this will tie into next week, our oldest brother-in-law, I'm in the Dodgen family, so Glenda, who's the oldest sister, her husband for many years, Benton Berry, was just such a superb Bible class teacher. 4 to 6 page outline every week, very thoughtful. And I had him come visit. We had a summer series on people who were just regular members and people who were just faithful in serving God in different ways. And it was open. You could choose whatever you want to. And he said, I want to do in the book of Revelation, the dragon and the child. And obviously, being brother-in-law, whatever, I says, Benton, how come? He said, well, no matter how dark it gets and no matter how active Satan is, God is telling us his people are always going to overcome in the end. But in the meantime, Satan is going to do as much as he can to create as much division and problem and obstacles for God's people until that time comes. And what did we hear in 1 John? Oh, they went out from us. They were not of us, because if they had been of us, they would have stayed with us. And we're going to be introduced to, and I have actually used this term specifically on a few occasions, we're going to be introduced to Diotrephes, who wants to be first. As one of our authors says today, he wanted to be the church boss. And look at how Satan can use someone who is self-willed and wants to be first in order to create division in the church. And as we go through this, Les and Jerry and Charles will have people's faces from the past that will come up, and you start reading of this character like Diotrephes, and Les is going to be thinking, oh yeah, no, that was brother so-and-so at such and such a church. And Charles will be thinking, yeah, I met him in such and such a place. And next week, as we move into Jude, we're going to start hearing terms like waterless clouds, uprooted trees, these people that Satan, I think, is trying to use in the church to recapture as much ground as he can, to create as much confusion and division as he can. And so as we move to the latter part of the New Testament, in these letters, we get little snapshots of both the very good and the challenges of being in the early church. And because these things are written for our learning, we will see and meet a lot of these very same people today. Following that which is good is our title today. And the central idea, spiritual challenges, and I just put ungodly people, which could be a number of other things, should not keep us from doing good. We had an older preacher come and speak to us when I was at Oklahoma Christian, and he said, fellows, he said, as you go out, at different times you'll propose something and the elders will turn it down, or you'll want to do something and it won't be approved, or you're really excited about something and it doesn't happen. But he said, only you can prevent yourself from teaching people the truth of the gospel in spite of what happens with those decisions. But he said it's amazing how many people will let something like that just kind of put the brakes on and dampen them. And he said, you're the only person who can prevent yourself from teaching people the truth. You're not dependent upon other people's decisions to do that. And so what I want to encourage us is that, and you think about the 12 apostles, the other 11 apostles did not allow Judas's decisions to deter them from doing what God had called them to do. So our aim is, I want us to identify spiritual benefits of committing ourselves to doing good. This is something that is a little bit off the track, but I still think it's helpful. We have, I think, at least 3 letters that are mentioned in the New Testament that are not in the New Testament. And I never worry about that. I think the things, if God inspired it, God's going to preserve the ones that he wanted. But when you read 1 Corinthians 5 and verse 9, and this is past tense, Paul says in 1 Corinthians, I wrote to you. And in English we could add previously. So at least 1 Corinthians is 2 Corinthians, and 2 Corinthians is 3 Corinthians. Everybody follow what we're saying? So even in the book that we call 1 Corinthians, Paul says, oh yes, I have already written to you. That letter wasn't preserved. And you look at the amount of time that Paul is incarcerated. He is going to be in prison in Jerusalem for 2 years. Well, Caesarea, but it starts in Jerusalem. He's going to be in prison in Rome for 2 years. And during that time, we have Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, and Philemon. Do you think Paul only wrote 4 letters in 2 years? There are no telling how many other letters were sent out. And like I said, I'm confident that the Spirit is going to preserve the things God wanted. So 1 Corinthians is 2 Corinthians. Colossians 4:16. When this letter has been read among you, and I'm confident that many of these letters would have been read during worship services. So he's saying to the Colossians, when Colossians is read among you, have it read to the church of the Laodiceans, and see that you read the letter from Laodicea. Some wonder if that might be Ephesians, we're not told, but this very likely is also another letter Paul wrote to the Laodiceans that wasn't preserved for us in Scripture. And so when we come to 3 John, chapter 1 and verse 9, I have written something to the church. Okay, so we're in 3 John, and John is saying already, previously, I have written something, but Diotrephes, who does not acknowledge our authority, and it appears that he hasn't let other people read the letter that's been written to the church. So all I wanted to notice as we look at this is that we have at least 3 samples of the many other letters that were probably written, and we know things about these people and some things that they said. We're not going to read the opening part of 3 John other than in chapter 1, verse 1, the elder, again, which most people assume is John, to the beloved Gaius, whom I love in the truth. And so in this short letter, we're going to be introduced to 3 people. Gaius, which was our topic last week, this godly man, and the recipient of this letter. In the middle, we're going to be introduced to Diotrephes, who wants to be first, who is putting people out of the church. And in the same way that Gaius is this very positive example to follow and to emulate, then Diotrephes is going to be a perfect example of what not to do. And then we're also going to be introduced to Demetrius. So we're going to have 3 different personalities in this short letter. I just want to read a quote from John Stott. He said, "We are bound to fellow believers by the special bond of truth. Truth is the ground of reciprocal Christian love. Christian fellowship should be marked equally by truth and love, and we are to avoid the extremism which pursues either at the expense of the other. Our love grows soft if it is not strengthened by truth, and our truth will grow hard if not strengthened by love." And we'd mentioned this last week, that Boy Scout tent that's got the pole and the 2 lines. It's oftentimes those 2 separate things held in equal tension that causes the tent to stand. And as much is said about love, there's also this foundational emphasis that's going to keep going about truth. So we're in the middle of 3 John, chapter 1 and verse 9. I have written something to the church, and then I just put, but Diotrephes. And then look at these 5 things. 1, he likes to put himself first and does not acknowledge our authority. 2, if I come, I will bring up what he is doing. 2 is talking wickedness and nonsense against us. And not content with that, number 3, he refuses to welcome the brothers. 4, he stops those who want to, and he's putting them out of the church. So here is a character in the church that is wanting to function kind of as the boss, and whatever he wants done is so important. And if you don't agree with him, he's literally trying to put people out of the church. He doesn't want to welcome the visiting teachers and preachers. I always loved classes with Raymond Kelsey because he had worked with and in the church for so long. And just speaking about elders, he got up one day and he drew an umbrella. And then over the top of it, he said, fellows, he said, as far as the elder is concerned with both the church and community, he said, if we had one word for an elder, it'd be the word blameless. There's not anything about this man. You say, well, he's a good man, but, and then here comes something else. So he's blameless. Wife, family, children, character. And so he said, I think of the overall term for an elder's functioning in the church community is that he's blameless. He said, however, when you look within the eldership itself, he said, I think the most important term is that he is not self-willed. And again, Les and Charles are going to be thinking, yes, I have met some men who just, whether it was politics, whether they just were determined to get their way, and that can be so destructive. And I can just quietly say it's so wonderful to be working with an eldership that we have none of those characteristics in our eldership. And you look at those terms, blameless, and he is not self-willed, then that allows the church to function in a way that we all can contribute and we can discuss and even we can disagree without becoming disagreeable. As far as I know, Bob Pope is still alive, a long-term elder at Eastside. And I was in an elders meeting, and this was not a matter of doctrine, it was a matter of opinion. And as I said last week, my observation is that the majority, sometimes up to 90% of our church problems are not doctrinal. They start as matters of opinion and personality, and then at a point in time, we bring Scripture in, or mother, or someone else like the disciples to try to get our way. And so a point came up, and the elders were saying, well, we think we're going to do this, this, and this. And Bob was just, he says, guys, I just don't think that's a good idea. And he was just against it. He would say, again it. I'm against it. I'm not really for that. And out of respect, the elder says, well, let's think about this and pray about this, and next week we'll come back and we'll make a decision. And nothing had changed the next week. And they said, you know, this will do this and this and this. And Bob just said, guys, I don't think this is the best thing to do. And they finally said, well, we need to kind of have a consensus on this. And they decided, well, this is what we're going to do, and watch what happens. The guy who's against it said, well, if that's what we are going to do, then I need to make the announcement next week that this is what the elders have decided to do. So what happens within an eldership when the guy, and again, not doctrine, personal matter, when the guy who was against it stands up and you would think it was his idea? The elders have decided to do this, and we're going to do this, and we're going to do this. And like I said, it was a matter of opinion, not doctrine. But what happens when a person is not self-willed, and what we are going to do and decide as eldership is more important than what I want to do? Diotrephes couldn't do that. He's going to complain, he's going to campaign, he's going to politic, he's going to do everything he can to try to get his way. And here's going to be the verse we're going to keep coming back to, chapter 1, verse 11. Beloved, in spite of Diotrephes, I'm adding that, do not imitate evil, but imitate good. Whoever does good is from God, and whoever does evil has not seen God. What an interesting expression. Demetrius has received a good testimony from everyone and from the truth itself, and we add our testimony, and you know that our testimony is true. I had much to write to you, but I would rather not write with pen and ink. I hope to see you soon, and will talk with you face to face. Peace be with you. The friends greet you, and greet the friends each by name. So I've mentioned this at the very bottom already, and I didn't get to talk to Charles and Les, but I'm just confident that the majority of problems that we have in local churches are more personality than doctrine. And especially when you have two guys who are really just strong-willed, it's just like this clashing of minds. And elderships have dissolved just because there was so much friction among the men that were there. And I just want you to imagine, what would it be like to be in an eldership with Diotrephes? I'm processing for a second. We worked for a number of years with an elder who had the worst bedside manner of any man I've ever worked with. And we had Sunday afternoon elders meetings, which is a terrible time, Bill, to have an elders meeting if you're going to preach Sunday night. And for nearly 10 years, the first thing Sheila would ask when I sat down was, do we still have a job? Ladies, can you imagine what it's like? Every Sunday, there's an elders meeting, and because of brother so-and-so, the first thing Sheila said was, do we still have a job? And I said, yes. And obviously, in these personal talks at home, she says, how do you cope with this? And I said, well, as long as the other elders protect me from brother so-and-so, we can stay here. If they join him, we'll need to leave. And look at Diotrephes and what he's going to be doing and the difficulty that will be in that church. We're on the back of the first page. John has previously written to Diotrephes, but it appears he didn't circulate the letter. 2:1. Note the specific objections that Diotrephes had to John. And so this is amazing. John's just not anybody. He not only is an apostle, he was one of the inner three. He was the one that was right here during the Last Supper. And Diotrephes is going to have nothing to do with either John or his authority. And that tells you something about his self-willed, is that he's not even willing to accept the teaching of one of the original apostles. I have said this quietly to young preachers talking about my church and my elders, and I said, I understand, but there's a real sense this is God's church, and we actually need to see them as God's elders. And people like Diotrephes, though, see this as my church. And in some cases, I've been in congregations where, 20% of the members were, quote, charter members. We were here first. The rest of you have just wandered in through the years, but we are the charter members. I won't tell you what my wife thought about that, but that is hard to have fellowship with people who are always one up on you. And if there's a special assembly or something, then we want to recognize. And I don't have any problem with pioneers. I don't have any problem with people who started, but this was kind of this, it wasn't a cult, but it was kind of, we're a little bit above everybody else because we are the church. This is our church. And you see that in Diotrephes in terms of him wanting to be first. And so look at number 1. This is under 2:1. He likes to put himself first. King James says he wants to have the preeminence. And the word, like we know the word Philadelphia, city of brotherly love, the word is phileo protos, love being first. And he is going to constantly put himself up and put himself out there. And I want to be first. I want to have the leader. And one of the definitions is to have an interest in the leading position, wishing to be first, with a focus on controlling others. 2, he does not acknowledge our authority. And John says, if I come, I will bring up what he's doing. And you think, this is not going to be very pleasant. But this, brethren, this is something really important, and we're going to see it more in Jude. If we have, and let's use the term from Acts 20, wolves in sheep's clothing arise, the longer we wait to deal with it, the greater are going to be the spiritual casualties. Isn't that right, Les? And when that is recognized, it may be painful, but it's not going to be near as painful as letting those people go for a period of time. And John is saying, if I come, I'm going to deal with this face to face. And I hope he got there and was able to do that. Look at number 3. He is talking wicked nonsense against us. He's not content with that. And this is a term to disparage by indulging in utterances that make no sense, outrageous statements, bad-mouthing, and the NIV just says gossip. And that's what he's, and again, and I just kind of shake my head and say, and this is what he is saying about one of the Lord's apostles. So if he's not going to respect John as an apostle, then you can just see that he really sees and feels like this church is his own. Number 4, he refuses to welcome the brothers. And how often does John talk about the importance of loving one another? This is the message, 1 John 3:11, we've heard we should love one another. 5, he stops those who want to, so his self-love and vanity is more interested in his personal glory than God's. And he puts them out of the church. And so these are the descriptions that we have. Have a quote from Guy and Woods. Diotrephes is ambitious, unscrupulous, church boss. Sounds kind of like the mafia a little bit, the spiritual mafia. He is opposed alike to apostolic authority. He's opposed to missionary work. He's a servant of Satan and an agent of the devil. Diotrephes' conduct was insubordination of the most advanced type, and the apostle promised to deal in summary fashion when he arrives. And then you think about this, and again, I'm with the Apostle John. Do you remember among the 12, there was one primary discussion for 3 years? And what was their discussion? Who's going to sit on the right hand? Who's going to sit on the left hand? And who's going to be the greatest? I'm sure these guys through the years after the resurrection were so embarrassed when the Gospels were written because they are so focused on, I want to be first, and again, I want to be on this side. And when 2 of the apostles bring their mother into this, you know, any of you that have had teenage children, if a teenager comes to you and says, I want you to say yes before I tell you what I'm going to ask you, what are you going to do as a parent? There's no way you're going to say yes. Lord, I want you to grant what I would request to you. And you can see Jesus thinking, okay, something's going to be coming. Oh, I want my sons to sit on your right hand and your left hand. And the term is the other 10 are indignant. My dad would say hacked off. Guys, this isn't fair to bring mom into this. It's one thing for this to be a guy thing that we're trying to figure out who's on the right hand and the left hand. And that's not fair. You don't bring mother into this guy's thing. Well, John has dealt with this I want to be first mentality through the whole ministry of Jesus. And then here we are years later, and the same thing is coming up again with Diotrephes. But notice what Jesus says in Luke 22. A dispute arose among them who was the greatest, and he said, the kings of the Gentiles exercise lordship over them and authority. They're called benefactors. It is not so with you. Let the greatest be your servant, or the youngest, and the leader is the one who serves. So again, it doesn't appear so much that Diotrephes is a false teacher. I think John would have identified that, but it's this desire to be first that is causing both the trouble in the church and in many other things. When you turn to the next page, this is at the heart of, in spite of what is going on with this man, do not imitate what is evil, but what is good. Whoever does good is from God, and whoever does evil has not seen God. And the same type thing, even if I'm in a church that's having difficulty, that doesn't prevent me from serving God and doing good things. We've done this, and it's been several weeks, but we'll do this very quickly. There are 2 primarily words for good, and the first is the word agathos, and any of you who have read mystery writers in a previous generation, her name was Agatha Christie, and agathos, is a word for good, and this is a good, and it's good inside out, but it has a good result. It may not always be pleasant. Okay, I wouldn't even try to do this with your grandchildren. My grandmother was a firm believer when you weren't feeling well in castor oil. Gag. And she would say, now son, you take this because this is good for you. My mentality was it was so bad it wanted to make you feel better where it had any medicinal effect at all. If you had a sore throat, she would squeeze onion juice and take a long swab and then swab your throat with raw onion juice. You didn't tell my grandmother that you weren't feeling well very often because her home remedies were worse than your illness. But she would say it's good, it has a good result in the end. Now, it doesn't mean that everything about agathos is bad, but the focus is this is wholesome, this is good, and the end result is going to be good. The second word is the word kalos, and you're going to hear calligraphy, you're going to hear calisthenics, that which is beautiful in form, and kalos is that which even the world looks at and says, oh, that's good. Like for years, Eastside has fed the Carl Albert football team on Friday afternoons before home games. And you talk with people who aren't in the church and say, oh, isn't that a good thing for a church to do? We typically close 200, 300 people a month, and even the world says, oh, isn't that a good thing? So there's two different words for good. I mentioned this in Sydney when Tim and Callie were there. Callie is so much her father's daughter, and her name is Callie, and I just mentioned Kalos. Father and daughter, without looking at each other, get on their phone, and she's thinking, I've been Callie all my life, and I didn't know where that came from. Oh, beautiful, good, lovely, on and on. And Dad's thinking, we named her Callie, and that's what that means? And so father and daughter are both online checking what the meaning of the word is. And what is John saying? Do things that are good. Even if you have someone like Diotrephes in the church, that doesn't prevent you from imitating and doing the things that are good. I want to turn the page to the back page. There's a whole lot can be said about these we don't have time for. Look at Demetrius. He has received in chapter 1, verse 12, a good testimony. You look at number 1, he's well spoken of by the church. His life is consistent with truth, and John will speak well of him. And I think here's the person, remember about Jesus, the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. Isn't it wonderful when the Word becomes flesh in a believer and we see godlike and Christ-like characteristics in these people? And you see this term, he is walking in the truth. His life matches his confession of faith. So here's the term I've already mentioned. When Paul says to the Ephesian elders to be alert, for from among yourselves, and again, this just gives me the chills, from among yourselves are going to arise from the eldership grievous wolves who will not spare the flock. And as I've said again recently, an elder can do damage to a church that an outsider can't do because, using our term, he has the church directory. But Paul is saying, if that happens, be alert, and you need to be dealing with that. And you look at this 1:1, there will be people who will, I put P-R-E-Y, prey on weak Christians, as we had in 2 Timothy 3:6. They will create disadvantage. They will take advantage of young Christians. And I use the term spiritually naive. There are some people who just don't want to believe that people will act like that, which they actually will do. So when you look at number 2, John is called the apostle of love, and there's so many things that are written about love. However, he did not so focus on love to the neglect of truth. And that's something that's very important for all of us, is that we need to have this blend and this balance of both of those things. And when you look at the life of Diotrephes, such a contradiction to the gospel by word and deed could not be condoned. It was no pleasant experience that awaited the elder, but notice this, truth without love is not truth at all. And Diotrephes is condemned not because he violated sound teaching about the person of Jesus, but his life is a contradiction of the truth of the gospel because of his self-love. So, what a wonderful expression. We're told John is wanting to meet Gaius and Demetrius face to face again, and Christian love and fellowship is such a wonderful thing. It's always amazing, for whether it's affirming the faith or other times, that people who haven't seen each other for years meet each other and they think, isn't this wonderful? Chris, come real quick. Keep you on your toes. Okay. You were in Amarillo. Your new wife said, we are going to start going to church.
Something like that. Yeah.
And you start studying, and what happens while you're in Amarillo?
Baptized in 1980, shortly after we get married.
Okay. And then how many years later you come to Eastside, and this guy sitting right back here comes to church? How many years was that?
I first met Doug Cook, and then later realized his wife's father, Les McGallagher. And Les started coming to church here, and back in 1980, Les is the one that baptized me. And I'm not sure when you started coming this way, Les, but you were preaching and teaching around and started visiting here when things kind of slowed down. The next thing you know is, Doug and his wife were good friends of ours, and never knew it. Never knew that Les was Jana's father.
Joy of face to face. And so much is done in ministry we don't know really until eternity. But what a blessing to be able to meet people face to face that we've known because of the faith and because of the truth. So with this difficulty going on, John sends wishes of peace to Gaius. In spite of him, in spite of Diotrephes, he's going to wish peace. I want you to greet the friends by name. And think about this. Jesus says, I am the good shepherd. I know my sheep, and my sheep know me. And isn't it a blessing when those of us who are Christians also know the Lord's sheep by name, because we're one of them? And I love that expression. No one will be able to take his name from the book of life. And one of the blessings is that as we do good, and as we serve, and as we're faithful, then we have the blessing, yes, of our eternal reward, but the blessing of living and walking with friends whose names are written in the book of life, and that's where we will be forever.